Zachary Taylor enters the American story as a paradox, an unpolished professional, a planter who lived most of his life in tents, a man of few public sentences who nonetheless became, by sheer steadiness under fire, one of the most quoted names in the country. He did not seek office with arguments. He acquired it by reputation. Before he was a candidate, he was a contour on a map of the West, the officer whose columns appeared where the line between frontier and country was being drawn in real time. He spent 40 years in service before he ever spoke as a politician. He learned on the Mississippi and along the Red River that logistics is the true sovereign of a campaign, that road and ration outrank most kinds of courage, and that men will forgive a general for almost anything except letting them go hungry. His nickname, Old Rough and Ready, was not a costume. It was a daily habit, a straw hat when regulations preferred plume, a simple coat when gilt was expected, a willingness to receive a private's complaint that looked to soldiers like respect and to some colleagues like laxity. The grand theorists of war made diagrams. Taylor made sure the wagons got through the bad place. He was not dreamy about the nation's destiny. He was practical about the day's march. He belonged to that early American type that did not confuse eloquence with competence. When his name arrived on broadsides in the late 1840s, it was attached to verbs, held, advanced, refused, endured, more than to adjectives, and that difference is the core of him. He came up in the army of mud and fever, not pageantry. Commissioned in 1808, he learned garrison life in a republic that had more posts than prestige. He saw the War of 1812 where it was least romantic. At fortified places in the West where the outcome turned on keeping powder dry in weather that seemed to hate powder, and on persuading citizens in uniform to stay 1 week longer than their enlistments demanded. He learned the Indians' tactics from the cruel education of ambush and pursuit, and he learned the country's appetite from the slow conversion of clearings into farms that arrived like claims on the future. In the Black Hawk War, he watched the collision of forced migrations, hunger and fear, turn into a campaign. Later, in Florida, he fought Seminoles through swamps that taught him how expensive it is to chase an enemy with patience and intimate maps. He never mistook those conflicts for clean stories. He was, as most officers of his generation were, a tool of policies he did not debate in public, the same man who would later try, as president, to keep slavery's arguments inside law, had in his personal ledger the ownership of enslaved men and women whose labor sustained his family's prosperity. He did not write treatises to explain that contradiction. He lived it the way his class lived it, without apology and without serious curiosity about the moral mathematics. The army was his field of clarity, the plantation his field of habit. He married into a life that tied him, still more, to the Southern pattern. Margaret McCall Smith, Peggy, became the anchor in a life whose furniture was often packed. Their daughter, Sarah Knox, would marry a young Mississippian named Jefferson Davis against Taylor's advice, a match that ended in fever and grief within months. Years later, during the Mexican-American War, Davis reappeared as the colonel of the Mississippi Rifles under Taylor's command, and the older man treated him with professional courtesy as if the dead could be honored by not reopening the wound. These private crossings of affection and duty ran under Taylor's public career like a hidden current. They do not explain his decisions. They prove only that the country's conflicts were also family arguments. His transformation from a competent officer into a national figure began not with one battle, but with a campaign drawn out long enough for his temper to be legible. James K. Polk's administration, following annexation, believed the boundary of Texas was the Rio Grande. Mexico insisted on the Nueces. Taylor was ordered to the disputed Strip to make a fact that could be read as either deterrent or provocation. He obeyed without embroidery. Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma followed in May 1846, two engagements in which Taylor's refusal to be rushed or impressed let his artillery speak the language that wins on open ground. At Palo Alto, the 8 and 18-pounders argued more convincingly than speeches. The Mexican lines broke where physics indicated they must. At Resaca, the fighting turned to brush and ravine, and the steadiness he demanded, fronts corrected under fire. Advances made not for glory, but because the ground required it, gave his soldiers the feeling that the man in the straw hat had already outlived the hour. He did not promise what he could not deliver. He delivered what he promised in the next sentence. Newspapers lifted his name like a banner because it was a shorthand for something citizens could feel: competence with a human face. Monterrey widened the portrait. He advanced into a city built to be defended and took it by accepting reality. Street fighting taught him that walls eat regiments. He used volunteers with a caution that maddened some warriors and saved lives that bravado would have spent. He accepted a short armistice after the city fell, not because he was weary of victory, but because he understood supply. Washington scolded him for that pause. He absorbed the scolding and prepared for worse weather, political and literal. At Buena Vista, in February 1847, he met Santa Anna's larger army on ground so austere it punished ornament. The battle was a sequence of near calamities redeemed by lateral thinking. Units shifted on ridges like pieces moved on a board whose squares were cliffs and gullies. A charge by mounted Mississippians knit a broken seam. The artillery, again, made sentences that men remembered. Davis's regiment helped salvage a flank. Taylor's line held long enough for night to behave like a reinforcement. All along the hours, Taylor's orders read like the Stoics' grammar. Do the necessary thing, now, in the place where it will count in 20 minutes. Buena Vista did not make him a master tactician in the books. It made him the Republic's favorite definition of a general, the man whose calm makes courage rational. The politics that followed were more dangerous to him than any column of enemies. The Whigs, who distrusted Polk's war and disliked Polk's method, and yet recognized the electorate's need to be proud of something solid, took Taylor the way parties often take outsiders, with a mixture of admiration and calculation. He had never voted. He did not speak their doctrine. He had owned people and was not in the habit of explaining that fact. But he had won battles in a war their opponents had chosen, and he had the virtue, in a democratic age, of seeming to belong at once to the campfire and to the map. Table. The campaign of 1848 packaged him as a man of no party and all country, paired him with Millard Fillmore to reassure northern merchants, and let Martin Van Buren's free soil bid split their adversaries. Taylor did not pretend to be a philosopher. He offered himself as an honest executive. He promised no crusades. He promised to administer the laws and keep the household solvent. In the chair, he was exactly what the voters had purchased: a manager with a soldier's conscience and a planter's blind spots, a president who distrusted abstractions that asked him to ignore how things actually worked. He assembled a cabinet that looked competent on paper and proved uneven in performance. John M. Clayton at State, careful and dry. William Meredith at Treasury, more theory than muscle. George W. Crawford at War, respectable and soon tarnished by the Galphin claim. Jacob Collamer at the post office, a decent radical in a practical job. William Ballard Preston at Navy, pushing iron and instruction forward. Reverdy Johnson as Attorney General, black-letter law in human form. Thomas Ewing to launch the brand-new Interior Department. The presidency he wanted to run was not theatrical. It was a workshop. He preferred memos to manifestos, results to romance. He was surprised, at first, by how much the capital needed romance to get out of bed. The gold news that Polk had announced ripened into a rush that remade California before Washington could invent a policy. Camps mutated into towns. A constitution was drafted at a pace that insulted Eastern doubts. California knocked at the door as a free state without waiting for tutors. At the same time, New Mexico, sketched on maps and administered by officers who had learned their jobs in an army rather than in a faculty, was plausibly within sprinting distance of statehood too. Taylor saw in these facts a way to avoid the parliamentary theater that had made his predecessors hoarse. Allow California and New Mexico to enter as states directly, let their own constitutions speak to slavery without Washington's middlemen, and thus skip the corrosive wrangle over territorial status that invited Congress to rehearse the nation's worst arguments. It was an executive solution, legal, clean, and calibrated to reduce the number of moving parts. The South read it as a maneuver that would cost them leverage. The North read it as the first honest path out of an impasse without bribe or gag. Taylor, a Louisiana slaveholder who had never joined abolition societies and never mouthed anti-slavery catechisms, found himself cast as a kind of accidental center, a man willing to let the New West define itself and to use force, if necessary, to keep the Union's law superior to any state's tantrum. Texas, swollen with claims it could not enforce without Washington's indulgence, announced that Santa Fe belonged within its generous boundaries. Taylor told his attorney general to find the federal law and his generals to prepare for a defense of federal jurisdiction if Austin attempted occupation by militia. He was not bluffing. He had buried men for lines on maps. He had no interest in letting state pride rewrite the cartography his army had paid for. The Nashville Convention gathered in 1850 to whisper secession and shout injured honor. Taylor, asked privately what he would do if any citizen fired on federal property, answered in language so blunt it was almost biblical. He would hang rebels with less ceremony than Congress needed to adjourn. That threat was the soldier speaking through the president and the father of a soldier speaking through the slaveholder. He did not parse motives, he counted facts. The fact he counted most was that the Union's continuity was more sacred than any faction's convenience. He did not like Henry Clay's omnibus strategy, the idea of bundling California, territorial organization for Utah and New Mexico, a stricter fugitive slave law, the abolition of the slave trade in the district, and a settlement of Texas's claims into one feast and forcing every senator to eat all the courses or none. Clay wanted a compromise carved like a statue. Taylor preferred to let the problems walk in, one at a time, and be measured against the real. He thought omnibus bills concealed mischief behind nobility and turned votes into masks. He was a Whig president who would not be taught by the Whig oracle. This independence cost him friends and gained him a strange coalition: Northern Whigs, some Democrats of prudence, and Western men who did not relish the smell of an engineered bargain. His policy did not have time to prove itself in the chamber. His body cut short the experiment. Before death came, the most memorable foreign act of his brief term had been caution disguised as law. Filibuster expeditions, romances with rifles, launched from American docks toward Cuba, tested whether the executive would wink at private wars when public law forbade them. Taylor did not wink. He issued proclamations, sent marshals, made it clear he would not have the flag dragged into a fight whose authors were adventurers in search of plantations. He approved, through Clayton, a treaty with Britain, Clayton Bulwer, that promised neither power would monopolize a Central American canal or colonize the isthmus, as if it were a chessboard between empires. Critics would later call the treaty a leash on American will. Taylor liked it because it prevented quarrels he did not intend to fight and fenced off a theater where private speculation could have become national embarrassment. He preferred plain fences to heroic speeches. His cabinet suffered a scandal he did not invent and, had he lived, would probably have ended with an insistence on resignations and a lecture about appearances. The Galphin claim, an old revolutionary account owed to an estate, was paid under his administration with a fee to War Secretary Crawford that smelled like influence and looked like greed. Taylor's own hands were clean. His instinct was for discipline and daylight. He resented learning that friends had chosen to confirm the capital's worst expectations. The episode signaled how difficult it is to run a decent shop in a city that suspects every man's motives and sometimes guesses correctly. It damaged him less than it damaged the Whig promise of austere competence. Had he stayed alive, he would have survived it with gruff rebukes and enforced retirements. Death transformed it into one more reason his successor would need to change the names on the doors. He died in the middle of the debate, suddenly, miserably, in July heat after a 4th of July ceremony where a president had done what presidents do: stand too long, speak too long, eat too quickly, shake too many hands. The story that the cherries and iced milk killed him is folklore attached to fact. He consumed cold and fruit after heat and speeches, fell violently ill, and within days was gone. Doctors, lacking the diagnostic tools and microbes we now take for granted, called it cholera morbus, an acute gastroenteritis that in that city could spring from milk, fruit, water, ice, or chance. A late-century exhumation, hunting rumors of poison, found only the prosaic. He was an old soldier whose guards against the weather failed him in a week when the country decided to invent a fable that felt neat. His funeral was an exercise in restraint. The argument he left behind was not. His death altered the shape of the compromise he had opposed and made possible its passage. Millard Fillmore, inheriting the chair, reshuffled the cabinet and embraced Clay's package with the help of Stephen Douglas's procedural talent. The Compromise of 1850 passed in pieces and as a bundle. California came in free. Texas's claims were bought down. Territories were organized with questions deferred to popular sovereignty. The slave trade ended in the district, while slavery itself did not. And the fugitive slave law was sharpened into a blade that would cut into Northern consciences and daily lives. Taylor would have accepted some of these measures in discreet form and resisted others. He would not have loved the fugitive law's reach. He had said more than once that he would abide by what the Constitution required and no further. He did not live to draw that line with executive pen. The ironies of his politics and the limits of guessing are that a slaveholder from Louisiana might have been the president who refused to make free citizens in the North the daily policemen of bondage, and who insisted that the West speak for itself without being staged by committee. He did not get the chance. Judging him requires holding in mind the two lives he lived and the one he refused to perform. The army taught him to distrust rhetoric that pretends reality doesn't exist. It also taught him a paternal style that looks in some lights like democratic decency and in others like the comfort of command. He loved the men he led the way a strict father loves sons he expects to be resilient. He made sure they had food and ammunition, did not let them be spent for spectacle, and punished where example was needed. He did not treat the nation as a regiment. He treated the office as a post, where the daily orders matter more than the drumbeat. He thought the Union a thing to be guarded with marshals and doctrine, not a feeling to be provoked into eloquence. He had no theory of the people, other than that they had hired him to prevent worse things from happening and to keep the ledger square. The planter in him never suffered public cross-examination. He owned enslaved people and did not evolve himself out of that fact. He was not the Southern politician who manufactured cosmic alibis for slavery. He was the Southern officer who treated it as a system too interwoven with his world to be questioned in policy statements. That temper, possessive, cautious, uninterested in ideological perfume, made his willingness to admit California and New Mexico on their own terms more striking. He was not a convert. He was an executive refusing to be made into a party's cudgel. He did not join abolitionists. He allowed geography and demography to draft the constitutions of a new continent. He might, if he had lived, have insisted that Texas learn the difference between a complaint and a right. He might have backed a line that separated federal force from state pride in a way that kept both intact long enough for another decade to pass. He did not live to test either of these mights against the world's weather. The picture of him that remains useful is unglamorous. See him at Buena Vista, hat pulled low, riding a little too close for a man of his rank, passing a word that is less inspirational than exact. See him at his desk, listening to a senator explain why an omnibus is superior to a law, and answering that he knows how to feed regiments and will try to feed the republic the same way, one ration at a time. See him reading a proclamation that tells would-be liberators of Cuba to stay home and obey the statutes until Congress changes them. See him getting the Interior Department staffed with men who know ledgers better than toasts. See him writing the instruction that if Texas marches on Santa Fe, Federal officers will be protected and federal law enforced. See him at a 4th of July ceremony, trying to give the nation the picture it still craves. A president among citizens, under a sky like a flag. And then see the sudden ordinary failure of a human body in heat. There was no villain in that last scene, and no moral beyond the one written in small letters across his life. Competence saves lives until it cannot. He was not loved the way romantic presidents are loved. He did not cultivate the applause that comes from telling people that their feelings are laws. He did not taste the intoxication of grand design. He was the man who made things work until he couldn't. That is thinner wine and better food. The tragedy of his presidency is not that he failed. It is that the thing he most wanted to do, usher in 2 new states without detonating the national minefield, was feasible and lawful and very nearly done, and that a week of illness turned the problem into a spectacle and the solution into a compromise with nails hidden in the wood. He left so little in the way of political rhetoric that specialists have to reconstruct him from orders. That is, for once, a kindness to the dead. Orders are more honest than orations. What remains of him in the country's habits? A respect for executives who do not pretend to be prophets. A memory that wars are won by quartermasters and patience. An example, rare and necessary, of a slave-holding Southerner in high office who would not be drafted into the logic that demanded new slave territories as tribute to honor. A warning, too, that even the best-run shop cannot protect a republic from the consequences of appetites it refuses to acknowledge. He cannot be made a hero in the modern style. He can be made a standard in the old one. When the Union later dipped its flag and drew its swords over the very soil he had tried to keep out of Congress's worst recipes, the officers who had served under him remembered that steadiness is a virtue even when the cause breaks hearts. Some of those officers became partisans of a rebellion. Some became guardians of the old flag. Most, in their competence and carefulness, bore his imprint. The nation's future did not inherit his moderation. Its armies inherited his method. He does not fit on posters because he did not rehearse a sentence for them. But if you are looking for a line that carries him, choose something from the field rather than from the balcony. Hold the ground that matters, and do not be hurried into wasting men for symbols. In politics as he understood it, California and New Mexico were the ground that mattered. The Union was the field that must not be wasted. He stood there as long as his body allowed. He was ready to stand longer. The Republic moved on. Fillmore's signatures, Clay's design, Douglas's cutting and stitching, a decade's worth of accelerants. And the man who might have preferred a series of smaller, duller victories became, by dying, a chapter break. Being a chapter break is not a glamorous destiny. It is, in this case, an honest one.